Let's talk a little bit about envelopes on the Osmose, and this will work on the Continuum as well. Now, a lot of people have been asking, how do I access an ADSR, attack, decay, sustain, release function that you'd program the way you would, say, on a modular or some digital synth where you have parameters ADSR. On the Osmose, there is no such thing. You have to program all of this yourself if you want such a function. But because the attack profiles are normally created with shape generators, the whole theory behind envelopes, at least from the continuum standpoint, was that your finger was more the envelope in how it was attacking the surface, holding something, and releasing it. Now, you can use these shape generators to apply attacks and even some decays and releases if you wanted. But the point here is that for most things, you will apply an attack profile, and you can see there are a number of shapes that you can choose from, and typically you'll use the unipolar shapes, shape generators that will start at 0 and give you positive values, as opposed to sines and square functions that would be bipolar. And you'll apply some kind of an attack, and then your finger will hold the key, and how you apply your Z pressure and Y aftertouch will really determine how your sustain function works. And when you release the key, then you can program a blend of persistence to give you a release curve, basically a sustain function that will follow this persistence you set, normally with a macro controller, so that you can set your persistence to variable values. So that's the basic way that most Osmose presets deal with envelope. They'll apply a shape generator attack of some sort. You'll hold the key and do something for your sustain, and then on release, this persistence function will kick in. And many, many presets use this kind of approach for dealing with envelopes. You can do some other things to more approximate a true ADSR curve. We'll talk about that later on, but first let's talk about the more common case of how you create these attacks and then apply your release. Let's talk about how this works in some simple examples. Here I have a simple oscillator set to X pitch, so it will track the keys on the Osmose as I play. It's set to spectral balance of 0.3, so some relatively small number of harmonics are going to be added. And on the output, I'm going to set a shape generator ramp down. So I'll go and I'll set a shape generator, and I'll be making sure that I use single cycle because I don't want to continuously trigger this envelope. I'll set a speed of 5 Hertz, a frequency of 5 cycles per second as the base frequency that the shape will take to run its course, and I will gate it on the standard W gate function. So when I press a key, the shape generator will trigger, and the resulting shape will be applied to whatever I put it on. Here, the amplitude of the stereo output of that oscillator. My volume is going to tail off to 0, and the sound should die away even if I keep my finger pressed. There, you can hear that. Now I set this relatively fast. If I want that ramp to take more time to end, I'll set that to 1 second. And you can see, even if I raise the key here, the note will still go through its full amplitude cycle because I did not gate anything, and Y and Z are not involved. I'm basically just applying this shape to my output amplitude. Now, if I wanted to, I could take this shape and I could scale it so that Z controls it. But what happens if I do that? Well, nothing if I press too lightly because Z is so low. So let me give it a little more pressure. The shape seems to be attenuated a bit because I'm going to have at the beginning of Z a multiplication of a very low amount of pressure. So to get something that will simulate the attack I had before, I have to press really quickly. That way I'll apply a big Z amplitude before my shape generator has a chance to finish, and I can get some of that attack coming out. Whereas if I play very slowly, I don't really hear very much at all, because by the time Z gets to a pressure where you can hear things, the shape generator has run its course. Well, this is one way to have something die off as you press a key. But let's take this one step further. So now I will add Y and Z to my shape. In this case, the shape will take over, and then Y and Z will become active and allow me to create a sustain on my sound. And when I release my finger, because the shape generator will already have run its full course, Y and Z will just tail off. I've taken the recirculator mix down to dry here so you don't get confused on reverb affecting my envelope. Let's set ourselves for 2 seconds so we can hear this shape generator evolve a little bit better. And now, you can hear the initial attack profile kick in, and it does it on gate. So if I set my sensitivity very light, it'll happen at a very light pressure. And then you can hear Y and Z take over for a sustain. And when I release, there is no sustain at the end, no release function. So this is one way to have your attack come in and also add sustain. Let's take this one step further. Now what I'm going to do is put a formula on the frequency of my shape generator so I can control it. Here, formula C, it goes to a value of 9.5, and I'll add an ancillary of 1/2 to that. So things will start at 1/2, 0.5, which will mean my shape takes at its lowest setting 2 seconds for it to go through its cycle up to a max of 10, which is going to be pretty fast. Then what I'm going to do on my second macro controller is to my output formula add a blend of persistence. On macro controller 2, my primary persistence you can see is set to off. I'll go to my secondary. I want W, Y, and Z to be the same values for my secondary. The only thing I want to change here is the persistence. So now, using this linear function that's in the blend that I could have changed to some other function, as I move my macro controller from minimum to maximum, my persistence is going to move from a value of nothing off to a maximum value of 78. And this will allow me to now control the attack rate and the release rate of this envelope, and the sustain is going to be controlled by my pressure. So let's make a relatively slow attack speed, and I'll put no release on it. You can hear the attack, but now, because I've tied Y and Z to this, I'll have a sustain. But if I quickly hit and release, I'm going to get the sound of my attack profile. But there's no release. So let's bring up the release a bit. As you can hear, I'm getting some release. I can bring that up way high so you can hear. That release affecting the output. This is how a majority of the Osmose presets deal with envelopes. I can apply these envelopes almost anywhere I have an input or an output in the matrix. A very common use of these shape generator functions is on the cutoff and sometimes bandwidth, but more often cutoff of a filter. Let's see how that might work. Well, I've set my outputs now to gate at a constant value, so pressure won't affect the output. I'll take an oscillator, I'll increase its spectral balance to give it some more harmonic complexity because I want to send it into a filter. I'll send that oscillator 1 into low pass filter on position 4, unity amount in there. I'll set the bandwidth to unity, and now I'll take my formula, and here I'll use a triangle shaped ramp. This will, in effect, go from 0 to 1 and back again. So when it's placed on a cutoff, I'll go from silence. If I have 0 hertz as my cutoff, the filter is not going to pass anything through. It'll go to 1 kilohertz because I set this to 1. I could have set it higher. Frequencies normally are in kilohertz when you see this F column in the matrix. And this is set to my shape generator, which I have my speed control on now, and I set the offset from a half to a quarter because I'd like this to go through a little bit longer motion. I'll set an attack speed relatively slow. I won't use release right now. And let's play a note. You can hear the filter is opening up and closing back because I go from 0 hertz as the cutoff up to 1 kilohertz and back. Of course, I could change that to, say, 4.5 kilohertz. You can set macrocontrollers or formulas using Y or Z to change your cutoff frequency. Very common in these presets. Go back to 1 kilohertz. I could change my bandwidth. And I get that kind of wah effect that you can create. But you'll notice there's no release, and even if I bring the release up, I have no release. Why is that? Because I gated the output. So when I lift my finger, all that sound is going to stop in this case. If I'd set this to a constant instead, and you have to be very careful setting your SLSR values to constants, because unless you are sure that the volume is handled somewhere else in your matrix to make sure it's not going to just blast out the minute you set a constant there, you can get some very loud sounds. Another reason to always turn your gain down when you're experimenting. Now, the output is going to be maintained at 0.4. Whatever I send to SLSR, it's going to come out at 0.4 now. I'll set a relatively high release, and you can hear. Now that release is taking effect. I set it even higher. And this now is a way that I can impose envelopes on filters. And in this case, the sound will eventually die away if I hold it because I did not add Y or Z as pressure components to keep the sustain going. Now, I don't want to just add things here because that will create a non-zero value and my output is set to a constant. So let's go back to gate that just to be safe. One other thing we can do here is add a second formula. Let's take my triangle and I'll add another gated formula to it. Here, just to ramp up. This is done sometimes in presets to give you a more complex envelope. In this case, as I'm coming back down on the triangle part, the formula I've added is still moving up for its second half. So basically, I'm adding a decay element to this, and because when you ramp a shape generator to a maximum point, it stays there. Now when I play these together, they will not go back to a zero volume. What you're hearing is the maximum ramp rate that's taking over after the triangle part has gone back down to 0. This actually adds a little bit more of an attack snap on the sound. Maybe you don't want that. You can adjust for that in other ways. This just goes to show you some presets can do some pretty sophisticated things with shape generators to create complex shapes. Of course, I can apply these envelope functions to other things. Here, I have an oscillator. I set it to a pretty low spectral balance because I want to use that as a modulator on another oscillator, a sine in this case. So I'll send oscillator 1 into oscillator 2 using my ramp up shape generator. The output on this one I'm going to gate, but I'm going to scale it to Z. So now my output volume will be Z scaled because this oscillator will always be outputting. The effect I have here now will be to pulse this modulation into oscillator 2, where it ramps up to a modulated sound that is maintained. What if I used a triangle here? Well, now I'm going to go from no modulation, 0, to a maximum and come back to none again. So it should go from an initial sine to the maximum complexity of this modulation at its peak, and then go back to a sine. And that's exactly what happens. And this probably would sound better maybe at a faster rate. So I think you get the basics here that you can do a lot with just creating some shape generator based attack profile. Add in Z pressure and Y aftertouch components if you want to. And then if you want, put a persistence blend on release. Now in the next video, we'll take a look at real examples of this from a number of Osmose presets. But let's end with this question. Can you create some arbitrary function, some arbitrary envelope shape in the EaganMatrix? For example, I have here a Chaos Zadar Eurorack envelope generator that allows you to set all different kinds of envelope patterns, not just simple rises, falls, ADSR shapes, but some very complicated multifunction shapes with multiple rises and falls and all sorts of patterns going on in these functions. Is it possible to do something like this in the EaganMatrix? Even have curve-like shapes going on? Well, the answer is, with the new graphing note function, yeah, you can do this. And let's just take a little look at that. This isn't something that's really been used a lot in presets, but it is something you can use. And the problem is, in most of these presets, you may not have the ability to devote a whole bank of graphs, but it is an option that could be useful. So how does this arbitrary graphing function work? We'll do something similar to what we did before. We'll control the output amplitude with this arbitrary function we'll create. We'll use an oscillator, set it to some spectral balance. This is just so that we can hear the resulting sound. We'll take a single cycle shape generator. We'll set that with the macro controller so I can change its speed just like we did before. On the output for the SLSR, we're going to set a ramping shape generator, and we're going to set that to go from values 0 to 48. What we're going to do is use this ramp to index through the 48 values of one of our graphs. Let's take a look at that. If you notice, you'll have the 3 control panels on the left side that have various EaganMatrix and editor functions. Then there are 3 triangles underneath that. These are the graphs that can be assigned to a BIC graph We're not going to use the big graph itself, however. We're going to use the graphs that are associated with the big graphs with this note graphing function, and we're going to use the values of those notes as amplitude scale factors in my graph. We'll go in and we're going to show the breakpoints. This is a valuable feature for creating graphs so that you don't have to slide each and every value by itself. You can create these breakpoints to create a shape. Let's say we want to create a shape that rises suddenly, falls not to the base value, and when you do this, only use values 0 to 48. And then maybe we want to do another rise, maybe up to the top. You'll notice where I click, I get a breakpoint. And so maybe I want to create a pattern like that, a complex envelope shape. Once I have my breakpoints set to the shape I would like, and I can impose curves on this as well, but we'll just use linear curve fitting right now. I can activate that graph, which will put the individual graphing values in corresponding to the shape I created. Then I can hide the breakpoints, and I'm left with a set of values that will map to the shape I want for my envelope. And you'll notice there are 48 values that can be assigned in this graph. If you hover over them, you'll see what the values are set to. When I go back to my formula now, what this is going to do is ramp through those 48 values at whatever speed I assign my shape generator to. And you'll notice the ancillary function that's been applied to this. We'll set this to use the second set of graphs. That's the integer offsets number 1. That corresponds to the graph that I set. I'm going to quantize my values to 1, and then I'm going to scale them by formula D. Formula D divides by 48, so I'm going to wind up with a value between 0 and 1, because the maximum value in this graph is 48. I want to scale this 0 to 1 so I can create an amplitude profile that makes sense on output. So now when I trigger the shape generator, at whatever speed I've defined, it's going to quickly go through this shape and output that as the envelope of this oscillator. And let's hear what that sounds like. You can hear it's going up and down because I set a relatively slow envelope speed. I can speed that up and get a more complex output, very similar to what I was doing with the Zadar envelope generator. And of course, if you don't like that, you can go in, you can set breakpoints again, you can change things to some other set of values. Maybe you want to go up, down, and then have a shape kind of like that. All right, I can activate that new shape, hide the breakpoints, and now when I play, this one is a little less jagged, and that's the way you hear it. Let's create one that has some jaggedness to it. I've created a shape that's quite jagged. And you can kind of hear that. And one of the things you can do if you want to make things a little less jagged is take the interpolation and increase that. Interpolation will smooth things. And As you can see, you can add more or you can take some away, which really accentuates the jaggedness of that amplitude profile. So play with interpolation for other things too when you need smoothing. But there you have it, a very simple way to add a complex envelope if you need it, but it will use a graph, and these graphs are shared between the bit graph function and the normal note graphing functions. Next time we'll go through and take a look at some real-world examples of how the Osmose presets actually use these envelopes to impose these different attack profiles, where when you play one preset with a light fast touch, it sounds one way, and when you play with a smoother slow depression, it sounds totally different.